Thank you so much.
My name's Louise Binder, Save Your Skin Foundation Health Policy Consultant, and I'm welcoming you to today's webinar presentation entitled Proposed Patent Medicine Prices Review Board Guidelines, Potential Implications for Access. I'm going to start by doing a few logistical announcements, and then I will introduce my panel. I'd like to start by thanking Natalie Richardson, who has been a communications guru extraordinaire for getting us organized here today, and also for the first time presenting in bilingual format this webinar. So all participants in the audience for today's webinar will be in listen mode only for the duration of the session. And then there will be a question and answer portion at the end in both languages. You'll see at the right-hand side of your screen an option to type in a question under the word chat. Please feel free to ask your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to answer them in the last segment. If there are any questions that do not get an immediate answer, we will contact you with a reply and any discussion you wish to have after the webinar. If you wish to hear this presentation in French, as you can see on the screen, you mute your webinar display and call the numbers below, just below on the screen there. You'll see them in English. You'll see them, I guess, in English and French. So for English attendees, the translator will let you know when it's time to ask your questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. And again, if there are any unanswered questions, if you can send them to Marianne at saveyourskin.ca, you'll see that on the screen. I promise you that we will get back to you. And the slides will be translated into French and will be available for download under the handouts header in the control panel of the webinar. The session will be recorded and will be available on the Save Your Skin Foundation website and YouTube channel. And you will receive an email about this after the presentation. So now for the substantive portion of our webinar. I want to thank you again to those of you who've been able to join us today to discuss the proposed Patent Medicine Prices Review Board guideline changes slated to come into effect in July of this year. On behalf of the three co-hosts of the Patients Redefining Healthcare Summit, that is the Canadian Psoriasis Network, Schizophrenia Society of Ontario, and Save Your Skin Foundation, we welcome you. It may seem strange to be discussing anything but COVID-19 in these days of this devastating pandemic. In fact, it has never been more pressing or relevant. We know that this pandemic is generally already totally undermining access to medically necessary treatments. In our view, therefore, it is more important than ever in times like these to be vigilant about proposed health policies that may well even further disrupt access to necessary treatments for anyone living in Canada. So why do I say this? As you will hear, until late last year, we had no idea what the reforms of the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board actually were in practical terms. So how can we know if they are good public policy for patient access or not until they lift the veil of secrecy that surrounds the details? Now we have these details, and we can determine if these reforms are more or less likely to limit or delay access to drugs we need. We will describe the work the oncology community did to find out in this webinar. And this kind of analysis can be done by other groups if they wish. So here we go. To introduce my panel, I'm going to start by introducing my longtime colleague, Wayne Critchley, whose CV includes former executive director of the PMPRB and now consultant with Global Public Affairs. And Wayne is going to give us a brief background to PMPRB and describe the salient parts of the guideline reform for our purposes today. I'm also joined by Matthew Brougham, health economist extraordinaire, formerly with the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, and a policy consultant. I will explain more about his crucial role in this panel in a moment. He really is a rock star. My two hardworking and expert co-hosts of the summit are here as well. Antonella Scali, Executive Director of the Canadian Psoriasis Network, and Erin Boudreau, Director, Government Stakeholder Relations and Quality Assurance for the Schizophrenia Society of Ontario. After they present, I will present the oncology group recommendations to PMPRB, and I'll do that after Matthew's analysis. And then Antonella and Erin will provide comments and questions for both Wayne and Matthew in the context of non-oncology drugs and drugs for mental health, respectively. So with that, I turn this over to my colleague, Wayne Critchley.
Thank you very much, Louise, and good afternoon, everyone. And Louise, thank you and your colleagues for organizing this very important seminar today. As you mentioned, at this time of the pandemic, governments are really focused, obviously, on public health issues. And many aspects of government have been put on pause or are delayed as a result. However, one that is not on pause is PMPRB reform, which, as I'll come to in a few minutes, is still scheduled to go ahead, even though so much of it is uncertain and unclear and certainly far from a consensus. So let's go to slide 2, and I'll start with a PMPRB 101. And I think this is important because PMPRB is not what most people think it is. Most people think that it's a drug price regulator, it sets the prices of drugs in Canada, etc., and that it works very closely with CADTH and PCP, etc. Well, those things are not the case. First of all, PMPRB was established under the Patent Act. It's not a drug pricing act, it's the Patent Act, and it's part of federal pharmaceutical patent policy. And when it was first set up, there was no CADTH, no CDR, P-coder, no PCPA. In fact, provinces at that time did not even negotiate prices for drugs. They just listed new drugs on their formularies. The PMPRB is not a payer, so it does not run a formulary. It does not make any recommendations or decisions on funding and coverage of drugs. It's a standalone federal regulatory body, and its job is to ensure prices are not excessive. And that word excessive is important because that's part of the Act. And I might note that the Act goes back to 1987. The Patent Act and provisions setting up the PMPRB have not changed in all that time. So all the changes that we're talking about are policy changes that the government and the board itself are taking today, but without any changes to the actual underlying legislation. And the board is a quasi-judicial tribunal. So it does not regulate or set a price when a drug comes on the market. Its powers actually are to review prices after they're on the market and to take legal action if it believes the prices are too high. The ordinary time for hearings that the board holds into one drug is 3 years. And those hearings usually lead to appeals in the courts that go on for another 3 years or more. It is a very lengthy, costly process. So how does it work then? Well, that threat of hearings and legal costs and delays has encouraged voluntary compliance with the Act. And the board has been able to report throughout its history that it has fulfilled its mandate and kept Canadian prices lower than they would have been otherwise, and in line with Europe and much lower than prices in the US. Slide 3 gives us a different way of looking at this, and that it shows that now the PMPRB's influence is supplemented by the role of the provincial programs and activities. The total public spending on all prescription drugs has been under control for a long time. And in fact, it has declined relative to total health spending over the past decade. Now, when you hear headlines about huge increases in drug spending, etc., you have to look at the context. And the reality is that according to CIHI, we're as a country, we're doing a good job of controlling our spending on drugs. Slide 4. So what's behind this PMPRB reform? Why is it even going ahead? Well, first of all, it starts off because in 2015, the federal government included as part of its election platform that it would lower drug prices. And so that became something that the government wanted to deliver on. PMPRB, for its own part, launched a review and found, well, they didn't find, they already knew this, that the other players, the CADTH and provincial governments, always question why the PMPRB is relevant in the system today because of all the good work that they do. And so the PMPRB said, we want to become more relevant. And that led to a lot of the changes that they proposed. The first change has been to change the international comparator countries. This has been a long-standing issue. A lot of people over the years have suggested that countries should be rebalanced to make sure they're appropriate. So the government has made that change and removed higher price countries from the basket of comparison countries and added a number of lower price countries. It's really important to note here that the effect of this change alone is expected to lower prices for patented drugs by about 20%. That's the objective, and that is expected to be the effect. So that one change alone is very significant. But the board has gone a lot further, and it has sought to add new economic price factors. Let's look at that in the next slide. Next slide, yeah. So the additional factors that they want to consider are pharmacoeconomics, which of course, as you know, is reviewed by CADTH and other HTA bodies, size of the market, GDP. We want to look at affordability. These are all things that PCPA looks at in its price negotiations. And they've proposed, the PMPRB has proposed to add new guidelines for what it calls Category 1 drugs, which in essence are the high-cost innovative drugs that we see in the area of oncology in particular, area of rare diseases certainly, drugs like the drugs for Hep C that came on the market a few years ago. And for those drugs, they want to establish new price limits for the net rebated prices to public and private payers that would be based on the CADTH HTA review with further restrictions and reductions based on the market size. Now, in principle, this sounds fine, except that CADTH already does that. And PCPA uses that information in negotiating prices and conditions for coverage. And there's another problem, though, for the PMPRB doing it, and that is that these reviews are often uncertain. And this is something that Matthew will be in a much better position to speak to. The result is that there's a lot of uncertainty about what the price will be before a drug comes on the market. Next slide. I put this in just for your reference to take away. If you have trouble sleeping at night, you could pull this out and have a look at it. It would probably help you get to sleep, or it may give you nightmares. This slide just shows, this is the PMPRB slide to show how their new guideline process would work. As you can see, it's very complex, involves a number of new concepts and new acronyms. I'm not going to go into that in detail. Next slide is the most important, I think, and that's the impact on patient access. So we're looking at slide 7, please. The impact on patient access. As I mentioned earlier, these reforms create market uncertainty. Whereas today, a manufacturer knows the PMPRB allowable price before it comes to market so that it can comply voluntarily with that price. Under this new regime, it won't know the allowable price for 2 to 3 years after the launch. This creates a huge financial risk for a manufacturer bringing a drug on the market. There's also the risk of legal proceedings. The PMPRB has increased its legal budget and is building an additional hearing room so that it can hold more hearings, because it expects that it will have to go to court more often than they have in the past. And the outcome of the pricing is that the Canadian price could well be the lowest of all of the other countries that are in that basket today. So low prices, uncertainty creates a barrier to decisions by drug manufacturers to launch new drugs in Canada and even to conduct clinical trials. and there is growing evidence, anecdotal evidence at this point, but growing evidence that we've seen reductions both in new drugs coming to Canada and in clinical trials that appear to be related to the proposed PMPRB reform. So, next slide, and the final one, is the status of the PMPRB reform. These changes are all scheduled to take effect July 1. That's less than 3 months away. But there is no consensus among stakeholders on the need for reform and on the specific proposals from the PMPRB. The PMPRB will say that they have been engaging in consultation for several years and that they've consulted out, if you will. Stakeholders look at it quite differently. Consultation has largely been one way. We've had several opportunities to make submissions, written submissions in the last few years, but we have never seen any evidence that those submissions have had any impact on the plans that they propose to do, and they've not been addressed either. They seem to be not given enough serious attention. Very important issue is how is the PMPRB going to work in relation to CADTH and PCPA? We do not know how that's going to happen. PMPRB says CADTH is going to have to change the way it does things, but they haven't discussed or explained how they'll have to change, when that will happen, and there's no evidence of any work with those other agencies on making what would be necessary changes to the system. So all this uncertainty and as said earlier, lack of consensus has created a lot of anxiety, and pharmaceutical manufacturers have started 2 legal challenges to these changes. One in the Superior Court in Quebec and one in the Federal Court, challenging the constitutionality of the whole PMPRB program and challenging the authority to make these changes without making changes to the legislation. So that's it. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Wayne. So Wayne's described the PMPRB proposed guideline changes, and he's also mentioned CADTH, the present health technology assessment body that recommends to all provinces except Quebec and to the federal government which treatments are good value to fund publicly. PMPRB says it will be relying on CADTH's figures to draw its decision, to make its decision about excessive prices. But will it really? So if you thought that Wayne's chart was confusing, Antonella, Scali, and I put together a chart in a little different way, and I hope that it will be a little bit less confusing for you. So what we've done here is we've looked at the processes that CADTH uses and the process that the PMPRB is proposing to use to determine whether a price is excessive. So if we start with the left-hand side of your screen as you're looking at it, you'll see P-coder. That's the part of CADTH that deals with oncology drugs. And what it does is it makes recommendations about whether public payers should consider a drug for public reimbursement. That is it of value to be reimbursed publicly? And it looks at 4 factors, and you will see them there, and they're called the deliberative framework. So it includes clinical information, patient values, cost effectiveness, which includes something called quality of life years, which we've defined at the bottom of the page for you, and the feasibility of adoption into the health system. That, in my submission, is the most robust health technology assessment process that we have in Canada. The other process under CADTH is called the Common Drug Review, and that's our second to left silo. And it deals with non-oncology drug decision-making, recommendation-making to provinces. And it looks at 3 factors. Again, clinical, again, cost and cost effectiveness, including quality of life years, and patient input. Now, as I said, PMPRB wants us to believe that they're going to rely on the information from CADTH to make their decisions. And yet, if you look at the third and fourth slides there, you will see how very different, and as Wayne has said, how very much more complex it's going to be for us under that process. So here's what CADTH's going to do. For all patented medicines, including vaccines, and that in and of itself is a subject for a long discussion that we can't have today, it will pick an interim maximum list price for that drug. So when the drug is initially sent to PMPRB to determine whether the price that's being proposed is excessive, it will choose this interim maximum list price. And that will be the median of the basket of 11 countries that Wayne showed you. That, and as Wayne has said, that in and of itself will immediately reduce the price of those drugs between 20 and 30% from what we know they would be now. Each year for 3 years, or until the patentee has filed with 5 of the PMPRB 11 countries, whichever comes first, a final maximum list price for that drug will be determined. So that's for all drugs. But then there's a second analysis that will go on for, as Wayne mentioned, what are called Category 1 drugs. And Category 1 drugs are the drugs that are probably of most interest to many of us on this call. So what they will then do after they've done all the work of getting an interim price and a maximum list price, they will then look at getting a maximum rebated price for that category. And which drugs will get into that category? Well, you'll see down the farthest right side facing you a description of the Category 2 drugs. So there'll be drugs that have a 12-month treatment cost that's greater than 50% of the gross domestic product per capita. And the gross domestic product at the moment is $60,000, so that would be $30,000. Or it has an estimated or actual market size revenue that exceeds annual market size threshold set at $25 million across all dosage forms and all strengths. If you don't meet one of those 2 criteria, you automatically go into Category 2. But as Wayne has quite properly said, oncology drugs, rare disease drugs, and some other drugs for other categories, particularly biologics, will fit into this category. So we wanted to give you an idea of the differences between what PCODER CDR under CADTH is doing in terms of determining the value of drugs for public reimbursement and what PMPRB is proposing to do to determine whether a price is, quote, excessive to come into Canada. And the important point here is that PMPRB, if it decides that a price is excessive, and if a company does not wish to accept that and does not wish to reduce its price to the price that PMPRB wants it to, that drug will not come into Canada. That's different than what happens with PCODER and CDR. The drug can still be sold in Canada, even if PCODER or CDR decides that the reimbursement, public reimbursement system should pay for it. It's still in this country. Under PMPRB, it will not be in this country. So I don't know if that helps a bit, but I'm now going to turn it over to Matthew. And I just want to say that when I first met Matthew, he was working at CADTH, and he was honestly very patient and generous with me when I asked many very basic questions about health economics. And when the first draft PMPRB guideline changes were announced late in 2019, An oncology patient group to which Save Your Skin belongs, called Connected, which is chaired by Martine Elias of Myeloma Canada, we decided to do an analysis of the impact of these proposed changes on 6 recently PCODER reviewed and approved oncology drugs for different types of cancers. And as I mentioned earlier, PCODER is the health technology assessment body for all provinces but Quebec for oncology drugs. And it is the body on whose data PMPRB says it plans to rely. We had no idea what the results would be for these 6 case studies, and we were clear with Matthew that his mandate was to use his expertise to provide whatever results the numbers provided. This is true evidence-based research. So I'm turning it over to you, Matthew, to share an overview of the analysis you did, the results, and the conclusions you reached.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Louise. And you've pretty much explained briefly the introduction I was going to give. If you could move to the next slide, I'll just give a sense of how we'll be talking for the next 15 minutes or so. So I won't go as fully over the aims of the project. Louise has given a good introduction to that. We'll look briefly at the drugs reviewed, and then I'll talk about what we did in estimating this maximum rebated price. I'll just come back to that briefly in a moment, why we're focusing on that. Then I'll share the results and ultimately give you a sense of what the other observations were that were made. If you could go to the next slide, please. And just keep clicking through all these points, thanks. So what we wanted to do was look at a group of drugs that had recently been looked at by CADTH. Next point, please. And ultimately what we were trying to do, we figured these would be drugs that would be in this category 1 that both Wayne and Louise have spoken about. Drug with a fairly big market size as well. So they almost certainly fall into this category 1, and therefore they would end up needing to have the maximum rebated price calculated. And the question that all of us were interested in is using the CADTH information that existed for these drugs that had already been reviewed and already been recommended be funded, and in fact were already being funded. What would these new guidelines determine it would be the maximum rebated price? And as a consequence of that, we would possibly be able to form a judgment, and let's be clear, this is a pretty subjective judgment, about whether or not the drug would continue to come to the market when they were assessed by CADTH in the recent past. And the way we made those judgments, we weren't very specific in terms of the thresholds, if you like, but we just tried to use these subjective terms to be highly likely that it would still come to market, it would be likely that it would still come to market, unlikely and highly unlikely. And it's when you get into the highly unlikely, we were sort of thinking around the 75 to 80% prescription mark, that might be sort of a boundary where you'd say, okay, if you had to make that sort of price reduction, it'd be highly unlikely to come to market. Could you go to the next slide, please? Yep, thank you. So the products reviewed were all recent drugs, and the key element to these was that they had a positive recommendation that they were being funded, essentially, right? And they were looked at or reviewed in the recent past. We were trying to cover a broad spectrum of therapeutic areas and have done that reasonably. But apart from that, there was no real targeting. You know, we weren't looking for particular drugs in a particular area. We're just interested to see of a range of drugs that had recently been reviewed by the PCODER process. If you could go to the next slide, please. And click, yeah, thank you. This is a representation of how you go about calculating the pharmacoeconomic price. And, to somebody who doesn't look at pharmacoeconomic analysis regularly, this may spin your head a little bit, but it's relatively straightforward. There's a price that the product was submitted at, and given a cost-effectiveness analysis, what we're trying to do with this calculation here is determine what price would give you a cost-effectiveness result of $60,000 per QALY, right? So you might know from the cost-effectiveness analysis that under the price submitted and the various effects of the product, that it currently produces a benefit of one QALY at a cost of $120,000, say. Well, you're asking yourself, okay, how much does the price have to reduce in order for that QALY to cost only $60,000? And that's essentially what this formula tries to do. And so under the guidelines, you would make this calculation to come up with what they call the PEP, the pharmacoeconomic price. If you could just click again, please. And you would have seen on the earlier slide that in addition, there are some adjustments to the PEP based on market share. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this one. This is even a little more complicated to calculate. But essentially, we're saying that if it tiers of market size, then we're going to adjust the PEP down a little bit. It's going to become the price will have to reduce even more in order for it to meet the conditions. And this ultimately leads to this maximum rebated price, the MRP. So in essence, what we had to do, could go to the next slide. What we had to do was go to the CADTH reports and essentially extract the information from the reports that would allow us to, first of all, calculate that PEP, and then secondly, given we just used some rough estimates. We weren't trying to specifically calculate what the market size would be, but given estimates of the market size, what impact would that have on the estimated maximum rebated price? And our aim was to represent these prices as the percent reduction from, for example, the price that's been submitted under the CADTH review, where it's the price submitted to CADTH, or alternatively, a best guess at what the current price in the market might be. And of course, nobody knows what that is, but we suspect that it's at least 30 to 50% below the price that's submitted to CADTH. So we just used a conservative figure there, and we wanted to represent the price as that this calculation would produce in terms of the price reduction that would be required in order to be compliant with these proposals. And so it's possible to go through the CADTH reports and extract information that's necessary to make the calculation. There are some exceptions. That treatment cost line, the incremental QALYs and the incremental costs are almost always published. The treatment cost is not always published as part of the outputs of the model that was used to do the cost-effectiveness analysis. And so in some instances, we had to work out what treatment cost would have been in the model. And so there are some assumptions that have to be made to do that. In the case of this particular example, nivolumab, the treatment cost information was provided as well. So this particular example, all of the information was available, and so you were actually able to calculate what the price reduction would be to meet the threshold of $60,000. And you can see that under the best case analysis, you would need no price reduction, and under the worst case analysis, you would need price reductions in the order of 2-10%, depending on the market size. And in this case, in this table here, that's 2 to 10% price reduction from a best estimate of the current price. The other thing to note about this analysis and this slide in particular is that the guidelines require or anticipate having a base case, i.e. not the worst case, not the best case, but the one that everybody agrees is in the middle. And one of the key findings really of going through this analysis was that in the case of PCODA, mostly a base case is not produced, it's not discussed. Therefore, in essence, it's not adjudicated or deliberated on by an expert committee. So what exactly would be the parameters that would be used to do the calculations in a situation where a base case hasn't been discussed is next in question. Anyway, if you could move to the next slide, please. So what were the results? Well, here are the 6 products, and here are the calculated price reductions relative to both the submitted price or the current price. And then a question was asked, well, would the company want to launch this product given this is the likely situation they would face? And there's our judgment given the sorts of thresholds that I discussed earlier on. So you can see that with nivolumab, we used in the previous slide the assessment information for nivolumab. You can see that it's probably likely that at those sorts of price reductions still come to market. You can see dinutuximab, again, very likely to come to market given that there'd be really no need for price reductions. By comparison, you see something like osimertinib at the bottom there, in the order of 90%, 90 and above compared to the submitted price. And we venture a judgment here that thus it would be very unlikely to come to market under those circumstances. So that was the results, and the point, of course, is that these judgments are not easy to make, but it gives you a sense of how access might be influenced as a consequence of these reforms, if they were to go ahead as currently proposed. Can we go to the next slide, please? Just to finish, if you can click through all of these, then it's how I'm not in control of it. Thank you. So the key assumption really in making those judgments here, and I need to make it crystal clear to everyone, we're assessing the likelihood of the product coming to market in a world where essentially that maximum rebated price would be effectively an international transparent price. If that's not the case, then obviously those judgments would change quite significantly. So that was our underlying assumption, given that the proposals are fairly clear and the information that would be used in order to make these calculations are quite freely available in the public domain. So thus, we would, in effect, be thinking the MRP would be a transparent price. We also had to, as I mentioned before, make a number of technical assumptions just to be able to complete the analysis, primarily because the treatment costs had to be estimated or assumed in some instances. The other observations that were made was, as I mentioned, the base case not always reported. So essentially an inability to use information that's been deliberated on by an expert committee. And just the way that it's anticipated that you would calculate an MRP, you'd have to calculate it for the indication that the drug is being used for in the market. Now, if that was an indication that had many different subgroups in it, and you did estimates for the PEP based on those different groups, then ultimately you have to come to a single estimate, and you need to essentially create a weighted average of these results. And again, the ability to do that's not always clear, or not always that it could be done, and thus we pointed this out. And finally, there were a couple of situations where the formula actually led to negative numbers. So what a negative number means in this instance is that essentially the drug would have to be given away with a rebate in order to be judged, to meet the maximum rebated price. And of course, that's nonsense, and nobody would believe that that the formula would lead to that kind of an answer, except for the fact that it's difficult under some circumstances where you've already got a product in the market that's at a high price, and your product comes to the market and has to be added on to that other one in the market. And thus, under those circumstances, when you're estimating the cost effectiveness, you're estimating for the combination. So you end up having to have negative numbers and to be able to make that estimate. And there's a real question: what are the guidelines going to do about that going forward? So there are some technical difficulties with the proposals as they stand currently. So I think that brings me to my conclusion. So that's what we observed. The key, I think, just going back briefly to why these drugs, the key issue from our perspective and the reason for this project was really to try and answer the question with as little emotion as possible. What are the prices going to look like with this proposal? And given those prices that are calculated, what is the likelihood that access would be affected? And clearly we were trying to do that with the information and with the guidelines and interpret it as bias-free as possible in order to try and have a conversation about results free of that emotion around who else may be here and that will be here, blah, blah, blah.
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks, Matthew,
Pleasure.
very much. As a result of these conclusions, the oncology groups made 5 recommendations to PMPRB. And I'm just going to put them up briefly. The second page, okay, recommendations 1 and 2. These are substantive recommendations. So the first recommendation was that the guidelines should actually adopt the PCODER deliberative framework rather than what they are proposing to do with quality of life years now, which is use an ICER of $60,000. So if it comes out that the quality of life years would cost more than $60,000 a year, PMPRB is going to use that blunt instrument as the only decision making about whether a drug is excessively priced or not, whereas PCODER uses those 4 factors in a very nuanced way. And we argue that that's what PMPRB should be using, not this blunt instrument of $60,000 or less or more. Second recommendation was that any information about the price of these drugs should not be made public. We do not need those numbers to be public. We need to know that the process is transparent and fair that's being used, but there is no reason to risk a drug not coming to Canada because that price in Canada that becomes public is lower than a US price. And we know that nobody is going to risk a very big market for a smaller market. I wouldn't expect that they would, and there's no reason for that to happen. So on the next slide, we look at recommendation number 3, which is that we need an ongoing monitoring and evaluation committee that's multi-stakeholder, that issues public annual reports and that has at least 2 patient representatives, 1 from the oncology community. So those were the 3 substantive recommendations. And if we move to recommendations 4 and 5, these are procedural recommendations. And one of them was, to our surprise, we learned that there had never been a full consultation of Quebec stakeholders, including patient groups, in both official languages. And we said, you can't possibly conclude this until you do that. And we also had understood that there had never been a full Indigenous stakeholder consultation. And in our view, nothing can move forward without that. So those were our 5 recommendations. And now I'm going to turn it over to Antonella. And Antonella, I'd be interested to know if you have any questions for Matthew based on what you've heard in the oncology setting for the work that you do in the non-oncology setting for patients.
Thank you so much, Louise, and thank you to Wayne and Matthew for your presentations. And just for some background, the Canadian Psoriasis Network has certainly been following this policy area over the last few years, and specifically since the release of the proposed guidelines. And while we support the objectives of the draft guidelines to make more treatments accessible to patients in Canada and the sustainability of the health system, we do share concerns with the broader patient community about the potential impacts of this specific approach to lowering drug prices in Canada. So we're fortunate because there are many effective treatment options for people living with psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis. These treatments help people manage often debilitating symptoms like pain, itch, flaking, and the mental distress and comorbidities that often accompany them. And at the same time, there continues to be unmet needs for which we rely on the hope of clinical trials and newly marketed treatments. So our considerations for psoriasis include the fact that for many people, finding a treatment that works for the individual can be a lengthy and ongoing challenge. Several factors may contribute to this, including the very nature of psoriatic diseases and the tendency for people to build a tolerance to treatments over time. So waiting to find a treatment that works or hoping that they'll be able to access other options if their current treatment fails over time results in some people with psoriasis feeling like their lives are passing them by. They worry that their options may run out and that their symptoms may return or worsen, and clinical trials are often the only hope for patients in these cases. And from what was discussed over your presentation, Louise, and the other presentations we heard, we also very much value the contribution of patient input into the current health technology assessment processes in Canada as a crucial component of measuring the therapeutic value of new treatments. And so we're concerned that this perspective is missing in the proposed changes. We know we're not alone in this and that these are considerations faced by many patient community members. There are still a lot of unknowns for us when it comes to how these proposed guidelines may affect access for our specific patient community. So I really do appreciate this opportunity to have heard what the oncology community did to explore potential implications, and the opportunity to start the question and answer process. And I'll start by directing a question directly to Matthew about how this approach may be applicable to us and in turn to other disease areas. So Matthew, we know you talked a little bit about this. We know there are some similarities and differences between the PCODER and CDR processes and reports. In your assessment, would you be able to apply the same analysis to drugs assessed through the CDR process as you used for the oncology drugs the examples that you gave through PCODER?
Yeah, sure. The short answer is yes. There are small differences in the information that's reported between the two processes, but broadly speaking, the same information is available, and broadly speaking, same information that we've had to estimate under the PCODER processes and the PCODER published information, we'd have to do the same thing with the Common Drug Review reports. So it would be no different to the analysis that we've done currently.
Thank you. And just to follow up to that, do you see some therapeutic areas fitting into the model of your analysis better than others? I'm thinking of, drugs with maybe smaller treatment populations versus drugs for chronic diseases with potentially several approved indications and large treatment populations that are a lot like the drugs that our communities rely on.
No, again, I don't see any difference. I mean, the aim of the proposals and the guidelines is, as I said, to calculate a price at which you would gain a quality adjusted life year at $60,000 or less. And so you can do that for any in any therapeutic area. You can do those sorts of estimates. Some estimates are going to be better, more precise, more accurate than others. So some of these estimates are going to have a lot more uncertainty associated with them, just because you're dealing with smaller numbers and perhaps smaller other estimates have got very large trials and perhaps lengthier trials. So I think in the case of common drug review products, they fit more frequently into that category of having better and, well, not better, but having fuller, larger, less uncertainty with the information compared with some of the drugs that are used to treat very targeted indications. So, yeah, I think it would actually be better.
Thank you. Thank you. Erin, I'm wondering if we could turn to you. I know that there are so many specific issues and with mental health medications, and it's a very complex process to find exactly the right ones. Did you have any questions for Matthew specifically from the mental health perspective? Erin? Hello?
Oh, sorry, I just had to unmute. I'm so sorry.
Go ahead, Erin.
Can you hear me now? Sorry. Anyways, I'm just going to start off with a bit of a backgrounder as well. Thank you, Louise, and thanks to both Wayne and Matthew for their presentations. As the Institute for Advancements in Mental Health, until very recently, the Schizophrenia Society of Ontario, we envision a society that helps anyone impacted by mental health issues thrive. We call this vision Redesigning Society for Better Mental Health. This means creating environments that are more inclusive, positive, and accepting for people with mental illness, and within our own innovation platform, partnering with others to create solutions that can improve mental well-being. As I am, we will also continue to deliver the services and programs that formed our history as the Schizophrenia Society of Ontario with the people we help as a focus of our listening and compassion. Access to a wide range of treatments and supports has been a longstanding policy priority for IM. We believe that all treatment types should be easily accessible to individuals and families, including community services, social supports, and psychiatric treatments such as medications. We too share concerns about the impacts the new regulations will have on the quality and variety of mental health medications for those who need them. Medication is often essential to recovery and to the management of the symptoms of psychosis. Without access to medication, many people can remain unwell for years, increasing the demands on our health and social systems. In addition, response to psychiatric medications, not like a lot of other medications, is highly individualized, variable, and related to several factors such as genetics, age, sex, and socioeconomic factors. As a result, individuals must often try several medications before they find an effective treatment. The regulations appear too rigid to take this into account. And further, research finds that mental health medications in general are not prioritized compared to other types of medications by health technology and decision-making bodies. A report by the Canadian Health Policy Institute, for instance, found that a higher percentage of non-mental health medications compared to psychiatric medications are given a positive recommendation, with or without conditions, for drug plan coverage by the Common Drug Review. Although some mental health medications are eventually listed on public drug plans, wait times for listing schizophrenia-specific medications on public plans also varied widely in the study, with wait for coverage for some medications exceeding 2 years in Ontario. And just what is more, there continue to be inconsistencies about which medications, including different strengths and formulations, are approved for listing on formularies across different provincial and federal drug plans. So with all of that said, I just have two questions, and I'll try and collapse them for Matthew. The first one is, do you see mental health medications at all fitting into your model of analysis? And what do you see as some of the challenges impacting this therapeutic area as part of PMPRB's evaluation? I'll stop there. Take a breath.
I'm sorry, there was something wrong with the audio just at the start of that question. I didn't hear the start of the question.
So do you see mental health medications at all fitting into your model of analysis? And what do you see as some of the challenges impacting this therapeutic area as part of PMPRB's evaluation?
Yeah, well, I mean, for years, I've been involved in doing pharmacoeconomic analysis for 20 plus years now, and you can do a pharmacoeconomic analysis on any drug under any circumstances. And as I tried to answer before, that doesn't mean that they're all as good as each other. Some are, have real problems with the uncertainty in the data and greater uncertainties around the effects of the treatments, etc. Mental health is one that I've worked on in the past, and it does have some difficulties because it's an area where understanding quality of life is more problematic, and some of the assumptions that are made in order to be able to turn the effects of their treatment into a quality-adjusted life here are a little more challenging. But that's not to say that it can't be done, and indeed it would be done. And in fact, when you look through CDR reports, they've done cost-effectiveness analysis in mental health areas. So it's amenable to the analysis, but point out, some of these analyses are going to be more accurate than others.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you,
Erin.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're
You're welcome.
Thank you. We're just about at the end of our time. And before I turn it over to questions and answers, I want to say thank you to the panel. I also hope that we've added to your knowledge about this subject. It's a very complicated one, but I hope that you realized from this time we spent together that you don't need to be a health economist to determine the impact of these patented medicine prices review board changes in your therapeutic area. All you need to do is know a good one, and we know a good one. So thank you, Matthew Brougham. And if you, before we go to questions, I'm not sure if there are any questions. If you are interested in having Matthew look at any of the drugs in your therapeutic area, you can reach me. My contact information is at the bottom of the screen, and I'll be more than pleased to connect you with Matthew for sure. So with that, are there any questions, Nat, that have come in?
Yes, there are quite a few questions. If you want. There are quite a few. I'm not sure how many we will have time to answer at this point, but I think you're going to have some homework to do with email.
That's fine. We will make sure that any questions gets answered.
Yes. Would you like to take a look through the questions pane? If you can click on that, you would be better.
I'm clicking on it, but it's not opening questions for me. I'm so sorry. I don't know if it's something I'm doing wrong.
Not necessarily. Should we check in with the French folks and see if they have a question while we try to get you the questions?
Sure.
So Danny, if you have any questions for us in French? Perhaps not. Perhaps all of the questions will be answered by email.
Seems there are no questions in French.
No questions. Okay, thank you very much. Okay.
I actually have the questions opened, but they're just tiny. I can't get the full question, unfortunately.
Okay. Is there, if you can give me a hint as to which one you might like me to tackle first,
I can't because I can't see them. I can only see the first line. I don't know why that is.
Okay, well, there is one question here that I can certainly pronounce. You know, I'm not as adept at you at knowing which question to ask, but is there a way that, or how can we stop these guidelines from being implemented as proposed? Is that something we can answer?
Well, I'll try. I'm not, you know, this is not, for me, this webinar is not about stopping anything or starting anything. This is about evidence-based information about what the impact of these regulations, these guidelines will be if implemented as they are. And what we've discovered in oncology is that it would be very unlikely that some badly needed drugs would actually come into Canada. If you don't like that result, then I guess you start by making recommendations yourself. I mean, I would say do an analysis of your drugs, the same as we did. And when you draw conclusions that are evidence-based, that this is going to be either a limitation or denial of access, then you must make the recommendations to starting with PMPRB as to what the guidelines should look like. And then once the final guidelines come out, which they will soon, if we're still not satisfied that they have understood the problems with the guidelines as they are proposing them, and that they have not made changes to those guidelines that will allow good access for people, at the same time providing reasonable prices, because both of those are important, then we will have to go to Health Canada, I believe, because they report in through Health Canada. And if that isn't successful, we must continue up the Ministry of Health, to the Minister of Health, and to the Prime Minister if necessary.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, I'll choose another one for you here. And it's kind of a long question, so bear with me. I can repeat it if you need me to. What type of policy rationale has been provided by PMPRB on the scenario noted by yourself, Louise, differentiating the present to the future, in brackets post July 1st? For example, when drugs that are not recommended for reimbursement still are available in Canada and in 3 months will not be. What is the policy rationale provided by PMPRB for this?
PMPRB, I'm not going to say that PMPRB, I don't know that I'm not sure that PMPRB is saying what you're saying, but I will tell you that PMPRB says that the price of drugs in Canada is too high relative to other countries. I think that the facts don't necessarily bear that out, but that is what they say. And they also say that they feel they're not getting enough research and development being done in Canada, either from manufacturers. Frankly, I'm not sure I'm convinced by either of those, but that's what they say. And they say that by lowering the prices, the way they are planning to, they will actually create more access for drugs in Canada. I think that's highly questionable as well, but those are the kinds of things we've heard. Quite frankly, in a post-COVID-19 world, I think there are going to be a lot of questions about how we're going to get access to treatments, and I think we're going to have to revisit a lot of what we thought we knew.
Okay. Okay, and another one, will the PMPRB evaluate the prices of existing drugs, those already on provincial formularies?
I leave that one to Wayne, to you. Can you answer that?
Well, the new basket of countries, and again, some of this is still unsettled because we don't have final guidelines, but they can change their guidelines so that the new basket of countries applies to all existing drugs, and that would certainly have an impact on maximum allowed prices.
I don't think we have time for too many more questions. I don't want to keep people too much past the allotted time.
Okay.
You want to try one more question?
Sure, I can try. I think this might be just a little also an extension of the one we just had, but with these new proposed
let's try a different one.
Sorry?
Well, then let's try something that's a little different, maybe.
Okay. Okay, let me see. You know, there are a lot of thank yous and other comments in here as well. So just wanted to mention that people are saying thanks for the excellent information. We may need to just leave it there, Louise, and I will get these questions over to you so that you can have some good email conversations, if that's okay.
Absolutely. And Nat, is it correct that that not only will the recording of this and all the handouts be on our Save Your Skin website and YouTube, but also any questions that we answer, we will also post?
Yeah, that's a great idea. We can make a little report of the questions once you're able to answer them. Later this afternoon, an email will go out to everyone who registered with the recording on YouTube and the SlideShare link for all the slides in French and English. And that'll all go out as a package later this afternoon. And then the questions that you answer later, we can distribute those as you wish when they're done.
Yes, we can put them up. We can put them up for everybody as well. Thank you so very much to all of you for hanging in. I'm sorry we went a bit over time, but this is quite a complex and also interesting discussion, and very, very important at this time, for sure. So let's keep working together and getting a solution that gives us reasonable prices for drugs in Canada, but also provides access to all necessary medications for people who live in this country. That's a balance I'm sure we can strike. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you to everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.